Call a meeting to order.
Salute the flag, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can you pass these out?
Right. So we're gonna go in right to the right to know laws workshop.
Thank you. Oh, can I just look into that?
Yeah.
Okay, it was right here on the bill, right here next to the bill.
Oh, it's not mine.
Thank you. Well, good evening. Thank you. My name's Barrett Christina, Executive Director of the School Boards Association. Will Phillips, Staff Attorney with the New Hampshire School Boards Association. I want to thank the Wakefield School Board for inviting us up tonight to do a training and a workshop on the right to know law, and I think specifically non-public sessions and non-meetings under the right to know law. Understanding and talking with Jerry, we've got about an hour and 20 minutes or so. You've got a meeting regularly scheduled for 6. Understand we may be able to go over that 15, 20 minutes or so. We want to be respectful of your time. I see you've got a pretty full agenda for your meeting. Just to sort of lay out the format of the evening, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, not just the board members, but everybody knows, the right to know law is very complex, very voluminous, a lot of nuances to it. We could probably do 8 hours on the right to know law and still not have enough time to get through it all. So we're going to break it up and just do sort of the non-public session, non-meeting provision under the right to know law. I know some of the people in the room have seen me present before. We don't want to just sit here and read off the PowerPoint or whatnot. You could do that on your own. It's always a better conversation, I think better for the board and better for the public when we have sort of an interactive dialogue, if you will. We're up here not to read this to you, but to answer what questions you have about the right to know law. So the more interactive it is, I think the better it will be. We want to answer your questions. We want to be respectful of your time too. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Will. Will's going to, I think, handle the bulk of the presentation, and I will chime in when Will and I disagree, which is from time to time. So, but again, thank you, and turn it over to Will.
Well, good evening. Thank you for having us up here. I'll start by saying that the document that you have, it's a printout of a PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through each slide. Barrett said the right to know law would take 8 hours. This probably would take 2 hours by itself. But I give you this larger presentation because it really does include, not just my, hypothecating or making up stuff. A lot of it has the text. It's intended to be used as a document, a reference point. There's an index on the front page that will tell you, which parts of the packet you can go to if you're looking at it down the road. The way that I've structured this is I walked through first some basics of the right to know law, and specifically meeting basics, because non-public sessions and non-meetings relate to the meetings part. We don't spend a lot of time on either the records components, because typically boards don't have much to do with the records request. Usually those are processed through the administration. The administration is the one that keeps the records. The administration is the one that receives the request and then responds to the request. But feel free to ask questions as they come up. We'll do our best to answer those. A lot of the questions that you have I might address, but as Barrett said, this works a lot better and you get much more out of it if we're answering the questions you actually have. For brand new board members, it can be a little different, but for experienced board members, you have things that you've wondered about, and just feel free to interrupt and ask away. So we start off with, let's see what we start off with. I haven't looked at this in a week or two. We start off with the right to know basics. The purpose of the right to know law, as stated in the statute, is to ensure both the greatest possible public access to the actions, discussions, and records of all public bodies, and their accountability to the people. The statute, however, doesn't create the right to an open government. because that's found in our Constitution, the state Constitution. So the state Constitution's language is, the public's right of access to governmental proceedings and records shall not be unreasonably restricted. The way I like to look at the right to know law, and I think it's a helpful thing to take away, is that you start with the idea, as it's stated in the purpose, of the greatest possible public access. And what the right to know law does, it doesn't create that right of access because that existed under the Constitution, but what it does is it describes the reasonable restrictions. So you start with the idea that the government is open. The only times that the government is not open is if it's specified in a statute. So that's what I look to the statute for. That's maybe a little bit broader reading because there are, as Barrett said, there are some nuances in it, and sometimes, and technology is a good thing to think of. The technology and the right to know law are in different time zones. The right to know language is probably a good 20 years behind where technology is, and every time they try a fix to address it, they're already a couple of years behind. So it's a catch-up game, and there's several places where, in some instances, the over-reading of the statute can cause less openness simply because people won't talk about things. But in any event, so we start off with the idea that there's two parts, two main areas that the right to know law covers. First is the proceedings or the meetings. Those are the proceedings of the government, are the meetings that public bodies have. And the second one is the governmental records. And as I said, we're not going to talk too much about that. What we'll talk about is focus first on the meetings, and then what it means to go away from the concept of open meetings. So the meetings aspect applies to public bodies, not to public agencies, and there's, we're not going to get into the public agency part because the meeting part doesn't apply to it. But the definition of public body, it includes the school board, which you knew about, but it also includes any committee, subcommittee, or subordinate body thereof, or advisory committee thereto. So any committee of the board, any committee that the board has an official relationship to, any committee that's established by statute. So you might have a wellness committee, for instance. So a wellness committee, which might have board members, but it might not. It should. But that's a committee that's created by a statute. That's always going to be a public body. But you just understand that when we're talking about public body, and the requirements of meetings and things that you can or can't do, they apply to your board committees as well. Doesn't matter what you call them. If the board's designated or delegated one of its functions or asked for research on a particular matter, and it's designated more than one person to go do that you created a committee of some sort, no matter what you call it. So we looked very briefly at, so on page 3, you've got a definition of public body and you've got a definition of advisory committee. On page 4, it says key definitions, meeting and what a meeting means, but one of the interesting things about how this is used, for a definition, usually we're looking at a term. What does that term mean? For meeting, it's almost the other way around. If you see these 3 indicia, then a meeting exists. So the meeting is describing what's happening. So that there's a definition, but it doesn't matter what you call it. If you've got these 3 things, if it's got feathers and it quacks and it waddles and it's got webbed feet, it's a duck. It doesn't matter what you call it. Same thing with the meeting. So a meeting under the right to know law is the convening of a quorum of the body, so your committee or your school board, whether in person, by means of telephone or electronic communication, or in any other manner that allows all participating members to communicate with each other contemporaneously. That one, the thing you just take away from that, pretty much every form of communication you have is going to trigger this, with maybe the exception of if you were writing letters, and you were writing letters but you didn't have the intent to be circumventing the statute. If you have the intent to circumvent the statute, you're still violating the statute. But if you're just writing letters, there's not an ability to communicate it contemporaneously. And the question isn't whether you do communicate contemporaneously, it's whether you can. So email you can, text messages you can, Facebook comments you can, telephone you can, in person you can. All of those things are going to implicate the ability to communicate contemporaneously. Think about the board member who, maybe you do have one, maybe you don't have one, but the board member who comes to a meeting and never says anything. He's still participating in the meeting, whether he says something or not. So it's not whether you say anything, it's whether you're able to say something. And then the third indicia is the convening of the body, or the introduction of the communications, is to discuss or act upon something over which the public body has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. And I'll refer to them either as official matters or jurisdictional matters. For a school board, it's safe to say that if you're talking about it and it has something to do with a school, whether it's your money or your fields or your facilities or your personnel or your books, whatever it is, it's probably within your jurisdictional power. And therefore, if you're talking about schools and you've got a quorum, you're probably having a meeting, unless you're letter writing and you don't intend to be circumventing the statute. The thing to pay attention to a little bit here is that while any school matter is going to fall within the jurisdiction of the school board, you might be on a committee. So you might have 2 board members on a committee. You might say you have a committee of 3 people. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was listening.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'll, if you want to continue
Sure,
that thought.
go.
My thought was, as long as, if we're sharing or gathering information via email, that's one thing. That's distinctive away from making a decision or communicating a decision or action to follow. Those are separate things under.
Email can be used to share information.
Yes.
Attached is the agenda, attached is a draft contract, attached is an interesting newspaper article. I think that's fine. What you are not allowed to do, and if we look at the definition of a meeting, the contemporaneous communication and the deliberation about official school district business, and here's the example I give. Jerry can send out an email to all 5 board members that says, attached is the draft of the contract. We'll be reviewing it at Tuesday's meeting. Please come with your questions, comments, whatever, period. That's fine. But if you then reply all, I looked through it, I made some changes to paragraph 2, and then you reply all, I agree, I think, I think paragraph 3 needs to be changed. Here are some other comments on paragraph 4. And then you reply and you say, there's no way in hell I'm voting for this. This is the worst contract ever. That's contemporaneous communication that implicates among a quorum of the board that creates the meeting. Sharing information, passing along the agenda, the board chair saying, does anybody have any agenda items you want on the meeting? That's fine, but when you're getting into the substantive conversation that's deliberation and communication about official board business, that's considered a meeting under the right to, and there's court law, there's case law that supports that.
Yeah, I would step it back because, Barrett was giving the example where the email went out and then one person communicated, then another. That first communication, as soon as that first person hit reply all, that's what triggers the meeting.
Correct.
So it wasn't that the next 2 people did. And then deliberate in the context of the right to know laws, not deliberate like a jury does. So when a jury does it, they're making their decision. For purposes of right to know, deliberate means discuss it, because that's how you make your decision. And so the only things that perhaps are outside of the trigger are when you're communicating the things you need to communicate in order to get your meeting going. You need to have the agenda. You need to know what You know, if you're having a special meeting, you need to know what days you're available. So those types of things are okay. If you've got a committee that is going to be making a report, but you don't really want to spend time at the meeting, you might have a thing called a consent agenda. So the reports are sent out ahead of time, they're available to the public, but you don't spend any time at the meeting because the information is in the report itself.
Jerry?
Yeah. So would it be safe to say, though, that all three of these components have to be present for it to be considered a meeting?
Those are the three criterion elements that define a meeting.
So when I read the beginning of the third paragraph, to discuss or act upon, it seems to me that language indicates that it's intentional, that if the three of the board members met down at the pub for breakfast, and they were not going down to discuss that, but someone said, "Hey, what's going on with that budget?"
So I'll get to that, and in the context, we'll spend a little bit of time about that. But there is a purposeful element.
That's how I read it.
But one of the things about just using the example you give, we had one just the other night, and I was thinking about it today, and it's always the T-ball game or something. So
Sure.
So you show up at the T-ball game, and it's the first inning. And you start to talk about it, and you didn't mean to. It just you started to talk about it, but now it's the fifth inning, and you're still talking about it. At what point is it no longer purposeful? So that really, when they're, I think the state number one, the optics of just a quorum of the board standing there talking is never a good thing.
Right.
But if you have people wandering back and forth, and all they hear is you talking about the budget. Sounds like a meeting to me. I don't know, but but so I will cover some of those attributes, and then we had a question here.
So how does that apply the same thing, but with Facebook? Because you said it's not whether you do say something; it's whether you can. So like the town
funny.
groups.
Yeah.
So like 3 of us are all members of this group. For one of us to talk about school board stuff or school issues on that Facebook page when any of us can.
Yeah, so
That's where
at that point, I would say you're not convened. So you are convening a quorum, and so
But if the three of you start talking about the same thread or chiming in on the same thread, you probably invoked a meeting. If you're talking about official board business.
So
Let's go to Ralph first, and then we'll go.
That was actually an interesting. So let me just to make sure that we were clear on this. An interesting, layer to that. But so the fact that everybody sees it on there, that wouldn't invoke it. But one person commenting on it, you're going down a slippery slope there because you don't know if there's 45 comments. You were first. And then, someone, Bob chimes in, and he's number 16, he didn't see yours, and then Ralph comes in at the end, now you get all 3 of you on there, and you might not have even known it. And arguably, you can say, well, nobody had the intent of, that purposeful element, but there's a lot of places where you can step over the line, and it's easy for the public not to understand. The better idea is maybe have your board business and talk about your board business at board meetings, but, just a... But
Do you have a question?
Yeah, back on Facebook.
Sure.
I see the comments. I don't respond to any of them.
There you go.
Good plan. Good
I never
plan.
have. But I'm saying if Jen was on and Ralph was on, and I can't see Ralph's post, and I commented on that, now there's 3 of us.
It's possible. I mean, if it was in it, here's the reality. Let's say if you were doing it with intent and purposeful for the 3 of you to be engaging back and forth with one another, that seems like a purposeful violation. If you're the 50th post, as Will said, and that was the 3rd member of the board, the quorum of the board, and somebody took you to court over that, you apologize, you get a slap on the wrist, and the judge says, don't do it anymore.
So is the first person as liable as the second?
You're all liable. You're all
So if
responsible.
someone's talking about Facebook
I mean,
and
there
they're
is
doing...
personal liability under the right to know law, but the reality is don't think about it as 5 individual people. Think about it as the context of a single unit, a single board.
I'm not on that group of Facebook.
Good
Stay
plan.
off. I
Good
mean,
plan.
nothing good comes from the social media aspect.
It is a disappointment. However, I know others are. So if one person starts something that you know you want to respond to because it just went out over the entire
You can't
town.
control it. Even if you respond to quote unquote correct the record, does it do any good?
So the first person
Does it stop
just
the
gets it.
conversation?
So the first person just gets it.
It's a
Basically.
problem. It's a problem.
So there are boards that designate a person, and there was one board up north that had a very divided board. So they said 2 people. You're the voice. You're the dissent. And the only reason they did that was because they thought it was important, because there was a lot of misinformation, and it was misinformation from both directions. And each one was not just upset about the other position, but upset that the debate was based on incorrect information. Right. The fact is that nobody who's got a position, who's reading Facebook, reads a post and goes, oh, I agree 100%. I was mistaken. It just doesn't happen.
No.
And so the other thing boards can do is, there are a number of boards that have engaged just PR people, and this is actually part of, when I was talking about the vision between technology and the right to know law, makes it so that you can't participate in these conversations, and there are a lot of board members that they feel that's their responsibility. So in any event, yes, sir.
There's certainly the community members who believe they're a community member first, and much more importantly, they're an individual, and they enter these forums, these social media forums, as an individual. They don't declare that I'm here representing a school board or a board of selectmen or the budget committee. I'm doing,
I mean, they have the right to do that, but the reality is they're both. So, they can go on and post on Facebook all they want, but the reality is if other members of that public body start chiming into the conversation, it invokes their right to know.
Let me speak on that, because there are if you take that idea that as a board member, and it's true that as a board member you don't lose your right as an individual. However, you do have this dual position, and if you've got the indicia of a meeting, you're having a meeting. And here's maybe the easiest place to see this. So what if 3 of you who are predisposed to a certain political or ideological position, you just are getting together as individuals, but you're talking about school business just as individuals, but you would have done it last year when you weren't board members, and you're talking about it just as individuals.
Tell
and
me
then
where
you
that
come,
line is. It's impossible to identify.
well, I think the line is clear, and the line is when you begin to take action or you begin to assert a certain direction.
But so using the scenario I just brought in, the very first couple of years I was working for a school district, I showed up at a board meeting. It was a substantial real estate issue 25 years ago. I don't remember exactly what the issue was, but I walk into the meeting, and maybe you've had your private counsel come at times, and we'll sit politely in the audience here waiting for our turn. And I sat down. The board came in, they went through the first couple of items on the agenda. They got to, here's the real estate issue. Right at the beginning, I move that we approve this. I second it. 3-2, done. No debate, no discussion. Public had no idea what the heck happened. Why? Because they had met behind closed doors and figured it out. So how do you draw the line for the public? The easiest way to draw the line is don't have quorum discussions about substantive matters
Online.
Anywhere.
anywhere. And that's the bright line. Now that if you've got a board that's got a sort of the reputation in the community of being open and transparent, these little things that happen aren't going to be a problem if somebody wants to hit you on a technicality. But if you're one of those boards like the one that I saw do that, I hope that they get slapped hard. So decisions need to be made with deliberation at a public meeting, followed by the vote. Move on? Okay. Actually, not moving on because I was still finishing with the point that the distinction or the thing, the takeaway for, oh no, it's great. Again, the questions really are,
And we're here
what's
for you,
important.
so whatever we can do to answer. One other quick point before we do get on with the slides. We do have, Jerry, if you want to remember to contact Amanda or Will tomorrow, we have another training document, might even be on our website, that deals more with electronic communications by board members, and we'll put in a section about sort of social media and online platforms and whatnot. So there may be, it's not in this handout, but if it seems like it's a topic of discussion here, I'll direct you to that as well.
Sure, thank you.
And actually, this document and all the others are
I think they're all
up on our
online. Yeah, I'll
website.
check that
They're
first, yeah.
open to the public.
Open to the public, share them with your community members, whatever you need to do.
So the thing that I wanted to mention here, so for the school board, jurisdictional matter is pretty much anything that has to do with the school. Even if back in like 15 years ago, you might have a school board take up a resolution on, to oppose the war in Iraq. Obviously, that's not school business, but as soon as the board started talking about having a resolution, it became one. So, hey, should we have a resolution? Well, I don't know. If you get a quorum of people, now you're having the talking about a resolution of the board. But the thing that...
Another question? No, go ahead.
You keep talking about if it is a quorum. What if you don't have a quorum, but you have a sequential meeting? So with us, say 2 people get together, or a larger board that's of 11 or 12, so 5 people can get together, they talk about a topic, and then later on...
Couple points on that.
So it isn't just a quorum, is my
There's a
point.
provision, I don't know if it's the handout.
Yeah, I'll get.
Okay,
The
sorry.
meeting communications out, okay.
Yeah.
We'll get to that
Okay.
then, yeah.
All right, thank you.
So the jurisdictional matter thing, if you have, say, a policy committee, and you have 2 board members on a policy committee, but you have 3 members there, you can't talk about policy outside of a meeting because you only have 3 members, so if one person talks to another, that invokes the quorum. However, what if the 2 members of the policy committee, while waiting for the 3rd one to show up for the meeting, they start talking about the athletic fields? That'd be okay, because you don't have a quorum of the board, and it's not a jurisdictional matter for the policy committee. So just, there are some things that as board members, you shouldn't be talking about among a quorum, but if it's just committee members and you don't have a quorum of the board, that's okay. So some more meeting basics. Once you've got those 3 indicia, and here's why social media doesn't work, you have a meeting under the right to know law. And if you have a meeting, you have to provide posted public notice, have to allow the public to attend and actually attend in a physical location. Conduct deliberations and decision-making in public, unless a non-public session exception legally applies, and make appropriate minutes of the meeting. There are a couple of lesser requirements, but those are the 4 core requirements. Notice, public can attend, everything happens in public, unless it's non-public, we'll get to that, and make appropriate minutes. Then you've got a couple of more key concepts, and this is one of the ones that we touched on. But so under 91A2A1, a public body may deliberate upon official matters only in meetings held in compliance with the statute. I think that's funny, because basically what it says is, we're not kidding. What we just said in that previous statute, this is what we're talking about.
We're gonna reiterate.
Really mean
Yeah, but then you have in the second paragraph of that same statute, communications outside of a meeting, including sequential communications among members of a public body, should not be used to circumvent the spirit and purpose of 91A. So going to your topic, again, notice the purposeful requirement. So there are times when you might have an idea and you're thinking, I want to bring this to the agenda, get it on the agenda. So I call another board member. You have 5 members, you're lucky. 3 board members can't even do that. Or it's much harder to do it correctly. So I call the other board member and I say, hey, here's my idea. I'm I'm thinking of getting that on the agenda. What do you think? Oh, yeah, that's great. Hangs up the phone. Oh my God, you won't believe what she just said. So the first person had no intention. But what about the second person? Did the second person have the intention of invoking a quorum? You probably get around that because it's not a singular conversation, and in fact, it went two different directions. But you're having to defend yourself, and you know that old adage that if you're explaining, you're losing. So
So a couple other points on that too. Part of it depends on purpose and intent. You know, are you calling one board member and then the other board member and then the other board member and then the other board member trying to like count votes? Probably not appropriate. Are you Oyster River got hit a couple years ago. The board chair thought he was being funny. We went out and thought he was being clever, not even funny. We went out and did training, told him not to do this, didn't like our advice. Called another school law attorney, went out, training, didn't like their advice. You can see where this is going. Called another lawyer who didn't have any experience in municipal law or right to know law or public bodies. Said, read the statute, said, sure, you can go ahead and do that. So this board member, it was the sequential phone calls and the sequential emails. I emailed you individually, I mailed you individually, I mailed you individually, so on and so forth. Not a quorum, not a quorum, not a quorum. The judge looked at it and said, judges sometimes I think are wrong, but they're not stupid. Like, they knew exactly what the guy was trying to do, circumventing the purpose and spirit and intent of the right to know law. So those were, two here and two here and two here. Why are you doing it? Is it because you're at the ball game, right? At the concert? Or are you doing it to try and count votes? Are you doing it to try and line up and see where people are going? And I don't mean you, I mean hypothetically. So you kind of get into intent, which is, you got to mind read a little bit. So does that answer your question to some degree?
It does.
And,
Okay.
and this actually will touch a little bit more when we get to the exceptions to meetings. And then, so I just have a couple of little comments about digital communications. The first one, I think, I've covered. Whatever rules apply to in-person communications, it applies to digital communications as well. So we get to the sort of last part of the introduction. All meetings under the right to know law are open in that they are required to be open to the public. Non-public sessions, and notice the difference in terminology. You've got public meeting that's open to the public, and you've got a non-public session. And even though there's slides, I'll just hit the thing. A session is always part of a meeting. So you have to open your meeting, you can go into the non-public. That might be the only thing that you do at the meeting. You open it, you move to go into non-public, giving one of the bases, we'll get to that. You come out, you vote, decide whether to seal or not seal the minutes, and you adjourn the meeting. But you have to do those two parts. Non-public sessions, let's see. So all of the, you're all familiar with some of them, and we're going to walk through all of them, or all the ones that pertain to boards. I'll try to do it quickly. But basically, they all find themselves, there's the rationale behind them is one of three things. It's either privacy interest, or reputation, so it's some individual right, or it's a competitive interest of the district, whether it's litigation or it's negotiations regarding a purchase of real estate or purchase of property, sale of property. So it's your competitive interest. And when we look at the language of that, you'll see that it's actually tied to that. It's not just because you want to talk about the purchase of real estate. It's because you're talking about it and you don't want to be giving away, you don't want to show what's up your sleeve kind of thing. And we'll get to that. And then the third one, there's one very specific one for that applies to schools, and that relates to safety. So you've got personal privacy type interest, competitive interest, and safety interest. And those, just common sense would say that, those make sense. Why? That's why those it might be reasonable to have those in non-public. Yes, sir.
Before we get much deeper into non-public, I think this is important. In the open public meetings, it's important to know and understand that every bit of that public meeting needs to be discernible. There shouldn't be members muttering under their breath and making decisions, even going like this and talking so that the public cannot understand what's being said. That would be a violation of the right to know, in my interpretation.
We would recommend that you don't pass notes to one another, and that all the conversation be
Above board.
discernible. Yeah. Tracy?
If you can't find your place in something, or you're looking for something, is it okay to say?
I mean,
Again, it's one of those, you know, if Barrett and I keep leaning over and you know, we spend 12 minutes of a, you know, 1 hour meeting doing this.
I understand you don't want to interrupt the meeting, but just to avoid any,
But if it's,
to avoid any entanglements, perhaps just say point of order, Mr. Chair. Can you remind me what page we're on?
Oh, okay, I didn't think he was a point, okay.
let's see, back where we were.
We're
Yeah.
introductory, non-public
Yep.
session.
Well, so I wanted to
Page
go, yeah, I'm on page 8 because
Okay.
you've got, just want to see what I can skip through. A public meeting, did that. Okay, second slide on page 8, non-public sessions versus non-meetings.
Oh, right.
Have you all heard the expression non-meeting? Yes, no, maybe, okay. So a non-public session and a non-meeting are two different things. A non-public session is always part of a meeting, and although if you can read the right to know statute from start to finish, and you will not hear the phrase non-meeting, nor, by the way, will you see the word seal the minutes. The non-meeting is called that because, notwithstanding that you have the 3 indicia that I talked about, there are 4 exceptions where the statute says meeting shall not include. And so, for one of a term, because they didn't call it anything, what those exceptions are, the parlance came about that those are non-meetings. So they're just things that look like meetings. They have the duck, I mean the feathers, they have the beak and so forth, but for whatever reason we don't call them a meeting. So, the distinction is important because with a non-meeting, the very limited purposes or reasons to have non-meetings, the requirements, the technical requirements of a meeting don't apply. So for instance, you don't need a notice, you don't need minutes, you can have the communication via telephone, you know, the public doesn't need to be present, etc. So first I'll cover the non-meetings. The first one that, you know, we've already bounced it around a couple of times is the chance social encounter. So the first non-meeting is a chance, social, or other encounter not convened for the purpose of discussing or acting upon jurisdictional matter. So again, you've got this purposeful requirement, and so you might have the purpose of convening, but you're not convening for the purpose of conducting your business. Here's an example that comes up this time of year, is all the board members are going to go sit on the dais at the graduation. Are they having a meeting? No, because they're not conducting any business. They're not discussing any business. They're obviously there for school purposes, but they're not doing anything except shaking hands as people walk by. That shall not constitute a meeting if no decisions are made regarding such matters. So now I'll go back to the T-ball situation. And you've got 2 different things. I went to the T-ball game because my son's playing T-ball, and hopefully the rest of the board members have a good reason to be there. But you go to the T-ball game, you're talking about the Bruins, and you're talking about the weather, and then for some reason you're talking about the athletic field at the school, and that all of a sudden now you're talking about school business. Still, you didn't have the intent to do it, but as I said, at some point it becomes purposeful, and but where that line is, who knows? But the other part of it is, let's say that conversation only lasted 2 minutes. I think we really need to, get artificial turf. Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay. So you didn't intend to have the discussion, but the quorum just agreed that you were going to do something. So you got the unintentional part, but you made a decision. A quorum of you agreed on something. You made a decision. And that's also going to trigger a violation. So it has to be both unintentional and inconsequential. So that's, if you intended to have the conversation, you're already violating it. Even if you didn't intend on having it, if you make a decision, you violated it.
So if the end result wasn't, I think we should get artificial turf, it was, maybe we should talk about getting artificial turf, does that make it,
That's
there's no
back to
decision?
Barrett's example of you're just saying, hey, we should put this on the agenda.
Right.
But be careful about how much, again, how much conversation do you have before you decide it goes on the agenda?
We find
If you're
ourselves on the
talk-
slippery slope of the T-ball field.
Correct.
And so really, the best advice I can give is, as soon as you catch yourself talking about school board business,
Talk about the
say,
weather.
how about those Bruins?
All right. Start talking about the Red Sox for the weather,
Or one of you walk away and,
Go
go.
back.
So you can have the free conversation with the other parents at T-ball as long as 2 other people aren't here in a board of 5.
I mean, if you're sitting in the stands at the T-ball game and you're surrounded by a group of parents who are your constituents and they ask you, what's going on with the budget this year? Is the collective bargaining agreement going to pass? This, that, or the other thing. Yeah, you need to be responsive to your constituents, and there's also a human nature element. You're going to converse with people, right? If 3 of you are sitting there and the people start saying, we want the budget, flat this year, and you start discussing the budget, then it's,
Why it won't be.
I mean,
So one of us should just get up and leave.
I mean,
Right.
yeah, I
That's
mean,
the
we
best
take,
option.
sometimes we have
Don't
to
go
go
to
to
T-ball,
some
guys,
sort
that's
of.
my
I was
zone.
gonna say, I don't think we have anybody that has meets at the T-ball.
I'm a
I mean,
T-ball
unfortunately,
coach.
not the best of us. There doesn't seem to be.
Whatever it
Yeah.
may be.
Right,
High
yeah.
school.
It's my area.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
The
looking
soccer
around
game,
the
the T-ball
college
game,
soccer game.
Right.
Thanks, but he's older than college.
But I like to think in as bright a line as you can, because it's a lot easier to remember the bright line than anything else. There are nuances involved, and you'll poke at the nuances and you'll stumble upon the nuances. But if you try to observe the bright lines, you'll be okay. I mean, a judge might say, yeah, you shouldn't have sent that 3rd email. Don't do it again.
Right.
But if you look at them and there's 6 instances of that, that's a little bit different. Or I don't know, every single board meeting, you see 3 of the board members and they all go off and they all go meet over there and it's all private. And as soon as somebody walks up there, they stop talking, hush, hush. That's the kind of thing that, really the public wants to know what its government's up to. And that's one of the things when you read the cases on the right to know law, that's one of the little phrases that they use. The right to know law is intended to allow the public to see what the government's up to. So, okay, so let's see, non-meetings, I call that the recycling center exception, or the T-ball exception, or the avocado produce aisle section. So next item of non-meeting is collective bargaining. Meetings shall also not include strategy or negotiations with respect to collective bargainings. There's some more language about that, but basically it covers, how many of you have done collective bargaining for the couple? So, when you do that, basically you go into the room, you're all together at one point, sooner or later you'll separate. It covers the negotiations themselves, so you're sitting in the same room with the the union. It covers when you separate into the separate rooms called caucusing. And it also covers when the group itself is outside of, the negotiation session, in preparation is doing its strategy. It also covers when the board itself is talking about, hey, we really don't care if it's 1 or 2%, but we really need to have this concession on the length of the school day. This is our so you're talking about your strategy and how you're going to get there, and you're that kind of thing. So the board can do that, so it applies across that way. It also can apply if the board, as part of its strategy, is looking to, see how that piece fits with other pieces. So, a common example is if you're in a co-op. So where do your kids go to high school?
Spalding. And Kingswood, 10% to Kingswood.
Are they tuitioned, or is
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different, but, so in a co-op, you'll have voters who might see, let's say you have 2 unions in each of the high school, and you're a K through 8, so you have 4 unions. I mean, back when the recession really hit, it was not uncommon to have contracts fail. So you'd walk into the voting booth if you're SB2 or at your meeting, and you might have, you'd have 2 different meetings, but if you were doing SB2, you'd have 4 different collective bargaining agreements. So it might be a good idea for your boards to talk about, hey, why don't you do 2 years, and we'll go for 3 years, so that 2 years from now we don't have this thing. Or we know you guys are doing a bond. Is the bond going to be next year or this year? Because we want to, sort of stagger the financial impact. So there's some strategy that goes on that you probably have some room with, but it's got to be very specific to the collective bargaining strategy. But again, those are things that would not be meetings. Non-meetings, consultation with legal counsel. Basically, as long as the attorney is able to communicate contemporaneously, so it requires phone or Skype or in person, that would meet this exception. If you're doing it in the context of on a meeting night, so because you've got the whole board here, but you have a matter that requires legal attention, you can convene the meeting, and then you recess the meeting, you go in different room and you speak with your attorney. That has nothing to do with the meeting, because you recess the meeting, you come back in, you re-adjourn and move on with things, or you do it before the meeting or after the meeting. Again, it doesn't have to be posted. My suggestion would be that if you're doing it in the middle of a meeting, you might explain that to the public, even though you don't have to. But, wait, why is the whole quorum, the whole board is going into that room over there and talking out, and they don't understand the nuances. So it might be, something to explain a little bit. Also, if right before the meeting, everybody sees the whole board come out of a room, and I've had this happen, explain it. Just let them know what's going on. And then the last one, and this one is tricky. It's a remnant of time past, and it hasn't been clarified very much, but circulation of draft documents. There's no bright lines in there, but we think that the helpful way is, if a draft document is this exception only applies when it's something the board's already decided. But if you decide, here's the thing, we're going to write a nasty letter to this vendor, and we authorize Bob to do that. So Bob writes the nasty letter and sends it out to the board. That's okay. But what happens if board members disagree with the content of it? That's wrong. I would never say, that guy's my neighbor, I don't want you to talk about it. Once you start getting into the substance of that, it would seem that might be time to call for a meeting. But again, this is, this iffy part. If you're talking about, hey, you need a comma at the end of this, in the middle of the second sentence I was going to say the end of the sentence, the middle of the sentence on the, on the third paragraph on page 4, that would be okay. But so you just need to be careful with that. But again, this does allow for a circulation via email of that draft document. Just be careful in how you're responding to it. I suggest that when you're communicating via email about those things that the agenda, or about special meetings, or about draft documents, it's a good idea to use BCCs in your address line, so that if somebody accidentally hits reply all, say, Bob, what the heck's going on there? You have a vendetta against this guy or what? So now you haven't invoked the quorum. It's just the one board member. You're probably a little safer that way. And the other thing is, and this applies to the superintendent as well, when you're sending out these things to a quorum, just put a little reminder at the end. You know, don't respond substantively to this. This is something for a meeting.
Informational purposes only.
Yeah, just and it's really, you know, highlight it, move it around so people don't, you know, that don't just disregard the bottom because they know what you put there. Yeah.
Do you all have school district email addresses? Is that your primary? You know, put a disclaimer at the bottom. You know, we'll draft one for you if you need it. And other boards use it to just a little right to know law disclaimer, do not forward, informational purposes only, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's a great idea.
yeah, and have it like an auto signature, you know what I mean? So it's always tagged in there with every email that you send.
I'm going to disagree with him here. So the problem with doing that is nobody reads the bottom of the email.
Well,
I always say,
But it's there.
it's not for
Yeah.
people to read. It's for
no, but you're trying to remind the board members not to respond.
Not to contemporaneously and simultaneously,
Yeah, we can have-
you know, not to create a chain letter back and forth. But, so when you use that for informational purposes only, you can't, if that's a requested document, you can't block that out. I mean, you cannot.
still a public record.
It's still a public record, yes.
Unless if it's under one of the exemptions on RSA 91A5.
Yeah, no, that has.
It's still subject to 91A requests.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's just a recommendation. Please don't do this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's
Correct.
the
It's not a
idea is
government
telling your
Yeah.
board members, because sometimes you wait, why do we need to spend time talking about this? We have so many other important things to do, and all of a sudden that reply. So it's that reply. So the information itself might not have implicated the right to know statute. But if I send an email back to a quorum of the board and I'm making substantive discussion, or now you're certainly on the downward slope real quickly, or upward, depending on which way you want to look at it.
But the email is still subject to 91.5.
Correct.
Yes.
It could still be a non-public.
It may be exempt from
It might be
disclosure depending on the
exempt just
contents of the
because-
email.
Yes, just because it's an email doesn't make it a.
Remember how at the beginning we talked about like your default position is openness and
Yeah.
government, and the default when it comes to public records, the default position, your starting point is it's a public record unless it fits into one of these criteria in 91A5.
That was my point.
Yes.
And they changed.
And the reality is, from our perspective, I don't mean to interrupt you, Will. The reality is, if it's something that may be exempt, you probably shouldn't be putting it in an email. You shouldn't be discussing staff members in an email. You shouldn't be discussing student matters in an email. That's
Well,
just
it could be a letter from an attorney.
correct.
So-
or maybe you may get a correspondence from a parent
Right.
with, dear board member, my kid is a special ed kid, and these are the issues, and he's in the second grade class, and the teacher's terrible, and blah, 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 blah. So, that would probably be exempt, but yes, you are in possession of it, so I get, yeah.
And just the exemptions to records disclosure basically are going to follow those same three principles.
Right.
If there's an important privacy interest at stake, if there's a competitive interest at stake, but there's also internal personnel practices and a few other items.
Right.
So let's see, so the non-meetings, if it's a non-meeting, there's only the 4, then it's not, doesn't have to follow the meeting requirements, but now we go into the acceptable reasons to enter non-public session. So I can do one of two things. What time is it?
We have about 20 minutes
We
or
don't
so.
have to
Okay.
6:30 anyway, right?
6:37.
Our next meeting.
Perfect.
Okay.
Half hour,
Oh,
there you
there we
go.
go.
Yep. Whatever works for you, that's
So
work,
I could do this in one order or the other, and depending on the level of questions, we might never make it to the second one. So the first one is going through what the reasons to enter non-public are, and really what the nuances are, because my experience is that there's a lot of oversimplification of what they are. So you still get boards that say, move to go into non-public for personnel reasons. And what they're really going in to do is talk about overall staffing Well, that does not fit into any of the exceptions. So that's one thing. I can walk through the reasons to be in non-public. The other one is the technical process for doing it, going into it, coming out of it, that type of thing. But I doubt that within even 40 minutes we would be able to cover both. So I'm happy to do one or the other. And we might make it to the next one, but whichever is your preference.
Anybody have a preference on that?
Seems like there's 12 reasons to go into non-public. I don't know how many of those you want to hit on.
Yeah, well, I would just be hitting the ones that relate to the schools,
should do that,
because
we're
not
gonna
all of
accuse
them
of making
do.
wrong choices.
So one of them is for the parole board. And
Why don't we
of
do
them's
that,
for-
because we
Yeah, let's do that.
there is a handout at the end that helps you walk through process, a checklist that NHSBA
Yeah,
has
so-
put together.
We
Yeah,
have
so-
it from you guys.
What's that?
We have it from you guys.
Yeah, so just to show you what's at the end of the thing, just because I probably won't get there, about 10 pages in, you have the document that looks like this, and I think you probably have seen it. I have updated it in the last year, so I don't know how old yours is. Maybe I did it 2 years, I don't know. But it walks through, really what the process is.
It's after 26.
And then the next page after that, or the next...
Right there.
Thank you.
Yeah. The last few pages, or the last 8 pages or so, this is really, if you want 91A and you want it handy, it's right there. And, it only includes the parts that really are going to touch the school board. Doesn't go through some of the minutia. Okay, so let's go acceptable reasons to enter non-public session. The first one, and the first 3 are the ones that you'll see most frequently. Board may enter non-public session to consider or act upon dismissal, promotion, compensation, or disciplining of any public employee, or the investigation of any charges against him or her. So let's stop there for just a minute. Notice the any public employee. This is a specific employee. You're talking about one employee. You're not talking about how you're compensating all your employees. Obviously the collective bargaining you can do in a non-meeting, but if you're talking about your your non-professional staff, I don't know how, whether you have a support staff union, but all of your administrators or the people who don't fall within one of your units. A lot of times boards talk about the raise collectively. Well, you would do that in public session, because at least, unless there's another provision that applies. But the compensation of a group of people is not of any employee, the way this part of the statute's interpreted. Second thing, disciplining of any public employee. That would not include, if a board thought that, it was going to discipline one of its own members, which, by the way, I think is a useless endeavor.
Correct.
But somebody just censured one of their board members, and I think it was Nashua, maybe?
Yeah.
Nashua. My favorite one of those was, it was Conval about 15 years ago or so. The board had a bond that it was supporting, and one of the members very adamantly opposed the thing and went out and pounded the pavement and ended up defeating it, because the town that person was from, it was a large cooperative, that town overwhelmingly voted against it. Everybody else voted for it, but it shot it down. And so the board immediately voted to censure the board member, and a couple of weeks later, the union leader gave that board member the Nacky Loeb First Amendment Award. So, just showing it. And then that board member was reelected, I think, 3 terms after that. So
Right.
just don't, if the board member is out of line, let the voters figure that out. So the next part, unless that employee has a right to an open meeting and requests the meeting be open. In this context, this doesn't mean that, you're talking about an employee and therefore you have to tell, the employee gets to make you talk about it in public. It's when the employee has a right to a meeting, and in this context, meeting means hearing. So if you non-renew a continuing contract teacher, a tenured teacher, under the statute, that teacher has a right to a hearing, has a right to a meeting of the board, where the board operates as a quasi-judicial body. In that instance, and actually, let me just step back a little bit. All of the exceptions for the right, for non-public sessions, they're not mandatory. The board decides whether to go in or not to go in. If you want to talk about how much you want to offer on a piece of property in open session, you could do that. But if you want to do it in non-public, then you can do that, because we'll get to that exception. But they're not mandatory, except for this one, and then there's one other, where the board, where the employee, so for in this instance, the employee can actually make you go into non-public. It's up to the employee whether to have public or non-public. But, so the language here where it says, yes.
If they have a right.
If they have a right to the meeting.
And not every employee in this building has that right.
Correct.
For most things, that's correct. For most, the most common, obviously, are going to be professional teachers who are tenured and have a collective bargaining agreement. They will have 3 different ways that they get into a hearing. They might have, if you're trying to dismiss them, they'll have a hearing right under 8913. If you're non-renewing them, they have a hearing right under 18914A. And if they have a collective bargaining agreement and you've taken some disciplinary action, they might have a right to an appeal before the school board under the collective bargaining agreement. So there's and you might even have that case where you have a dismissal, non-renewal, and grievance all in one hearing. They've got little different standards and so forth.
But if you're just discussing an employee, say Jerry gets allegations from a principal that a teacher is engaged in some wrongdoing, but you maybe do an investigation first, so you want to inform the board in a non-public session. That does not mean, the language of the statute does not mean that teacher is informed of and invited into the non-public session. Only when they have a right. This provision of the right to know law, it mixes up and conflates a meeting and a hearing. But if you look at the other statutory schemes and provisions, as Will mentioned, 18914A, and the applicable Department of Education rules that govern the due process requirements when you're having a non-renewal hearing, they talk about a hearing. It's a hearing before the board, a hearing before the board. Why this sort of conflated that, I don't know. But this doesn't mean that the employee has to be informed as invited to the non-public session just because you're talking about them. Only when there's a hearing.
So the second one is paragraph B of 91A32. So all of these are going to be under 91A32. And if you practice that, in the mirror when you're making your motion, there's somebody, we did a training last year, and the training document's not from us, but the board member had been to another training, and they actually put 91A2. And so all of their minutes always said 91A2 something. So just 91A32, and then it's your paragraph. So the hiring of any person as a public employee, again, notice singular. You're talking about an individual. You're not talking about whether you want to add 4 teachers or add a Spanish option, which means you're going to have to hire somebody. You're talking about the person you're going to hire. And it only applies to an employee, not to an official. Now, for some purposes, board members and your treasurer and so forth, for some purposes, like the IRS specifically, or workers' comp or something like that, and I'm not even sure about that, but for some purposes, you're going to be an employee. However, under state law, when we're talking about governance, you are public officials, and those are distinct from public employee. So for a public official, this does not apply. So that means if one of your board members resigns, and you're, thinking about, the 5 people who want are interested in the position, that's happening in public. Think about what happened. How do you get elected? Publicly. You're doing it public. There is. I'll step back a little bit. The next one that comes is reputation. And it's possible in that context where you might be talking about reputation, and it's got to be very specific, and that might warrant in that instance going into non-public session. But think about what you're replacing when you're appointing an elected official. you're everything happens in public on the election. That's why in this particular session, filling that position is not part of the non-public. Yes, Ralph?
So I believe Jerry's already recognized the idea of if we have another publicly elected official as the treasurer of the district making a nomination for a deputy, that's not in a non-public discussion.
I think that's appropriate.
Yeah.
My question is, when you are filling a elected official's position, does the interviews and the deliberation
Good
have to be
question.
done in public?
a good
Because I
question.
know there was a
Different-
Supreme Court ruling stating it had to be done both in public.
I think you're probably talking about the
Lambert and
Belknap,
versus-
the Lambert versus, it's a little bit of a different, there's a lot of interesting facts in that case. NHSBA, we used to advise, let's say you have a vacancy on the board, we used to advise that you could do the interview in public. Let's say you had 3 people that submitted letters of interest. You'd maybe do an interview in public. And I've taken the position that because they're not public officials yet, you could go into the non-public session under paragraph C to deliberate about them. I do know other attorneys have given different advice though, that say the interview and deliberation should be in public. At the very least, the interview should be in public. The deliberation, different attorneys are going to opine differently on that. I don't know if you have a.
So
I think the vote should
vote should be in
always
public, too. Absolutely.
So let's
Absolutely.
before we get too far off this, let me get to the next one because and
That
then we'll
touches on
connect
the
and we'll connect the two.
Yep.
Okay, so in C, matters which if discussed in public would likely affect adversely the reputation of any person other than a meeting of the school board itself, unless such person requests an open meeting. So on that last clause, I'll just try to get rid of that quickly. It's the same as the other one. So the person has a right to the thing, and the instance that you'd be looking at here would be, say, a student manifest education hardship, or an expulsion hearing, or a long-term suspension hearing. They all have a right to a hearing, but they also have the right to ask for it to be in public or non-public. So that, that little part. But now go back to the rest of it, and note the qualifier, and this is a big one. The mere fact that you're talking about an individual doesn't mean it's likely to affect adversely the reputation of a person. So use that, I would say, sparingly. Don't just automatically assume that because you're going to talk about somebody, you're adversely affecting their reputation. And I've seen a lot of boards do that. Yes, ma'am.
If someone were to request that the deliberation be done in public, is the board required to do it in public
So
for
yes.
election?
I would say that when you're talking about the election of a person, by election in this
Well, I'm
context.
saying filling a position, elected
When we're,
position.
and one thing I would say about Lambert, and just there's a little bit of a disconnect, is Lambert specifically involved an elected position, and that's where just think about that. I mean, elections are open. Everything you're supposed to know about your candidate, and if they don't want to be open, then people aren't going to vote for them. So, but when you're talking about an appointed position, it might be a little bit different. But let's go to the question that you had when you said the election. So, but by election in this context, what we mean is the board vote. The board vote on filling the vacancy or filling the position. My feeling is that should be in public.
The vote should be in public, the interview should be in public. The question is, can the deliberations be in non-public? And that's...
So you have three people who applied for the thing. And I personally, as a board member, I have some very strong reservations. I'm an attorney, and I've had a case that involved this person, and this person was found to be not credible on the witness stand. It's not my client, obviously. I can't talk about that, but I really feel adamant. I'm going to move to go into non-public session.
If you have comments about that person that you feel would damage that person's reputation, make the motion to go into non-public session to discuss them then.
But what if a person requests it to be done in public, the deliberation on them to be done in public?
It's not up to them.
It's not up to them, it's up to the board.
Well, I would disagree with that. If the person that you're considering to either appoint or elect declares that they want this issue heard in public, it says right in this RSA, they shall be heard in public.
Where does it say that?
I believe it says right, Part A, actually.
That's not
The request that the meeting be open, it shall be granted.
That doesn't relate to the reputation provision of paragraph C. That only relates to public employees who have a right.
I would strongly, okay, so here we have an example of where a school board or a governing board has opinions or beliefs or evidence, and the person wanting to fill a position, appointed position, says, this has to be in public. I demand this be in public. I believe that governing board would be in some serious trouble if they refused.
Here's what I'll say. I'll say that issue has not been decided by the courts, and you're going to have a disagreement. You're going to have to decide, if you've got that situation, you're going to have to decide amongst yourselves how you handle it. And if the way this statute is set up, it's the board that decides to go into non-public. If you go into non-public and somebody feels strongly that you shouldn't, then the recourse is to file a petition with the court. And I can't tell you what the result is going to be because that particular question hasn't been addressed. The way the statute is set up is the board makes the motion, the board enters if they feel that the rationale is appropriate, but and read through the Attorney General's memorandum on the right to know law, you read through the NHMA right to know book, and you'll just have this is what everybody, the people who do this is what we think it says. And the only way that changes is if the legislature changes it,
Judge.
or if the Supreme Court says, here's what it says. We might have all thought it said something else, and certainly that's happened, several times with the right to know law. The way we connect it is if the person has, because how does that mean anytime you're going to talk about an individual, you have to tell the person so that they have the opportunity to make you talk about it in public? Because if they didn't have that right in the first instance, because you're thinking about a very specific situation right now, very specific, but this language applies to lots of other things. So how would that other person be able to, so you're talking about a vendor. You have a vendor, you've heard some things about the vendor, they're not a public employee, but you need to talk about that. Do you need to call that vendor up and say, hey, we're about to talk about your reputation. You want us to do it in public or non-public? That's why we think that it's just the general rule that the board approves. And I can't tell you that I know for sure here's what the Supreme Court would say. I don't know. I just know that that's the weight of interpretation is pointed in that direction. And certainly I understand the contrary view, and that's why you guys get to make the hard decisions, and we just get to sit there and say, well, sorry.
We get to come up for an hour and a half and then leave.
So Part 9 of that 91A 3.2, Part 9 of that says appointment to fill a vacant office, and then it cites 3.2 Part B. It does not include the appointment of an interim sheriff.
Can you read the whole thing in context?
Yeah, well, Part 9...
But the sheriff is an elected position.
So
it is, right, and so is the school.
Is that...
No, but
They're
we're
reading it
talking, I think we're talking
differently.
about,
Appointment.
We're not
Yeah.
talking about,
we're not talking about the official.
Right.
So the bold part of that part 9 says appointment to fill vacant office. Then it states the hiring, and it's in quotations, the hiring of a public employee, end quotation, under RSA 91-A, Part 3(2), Part B does not include the appointment of interim sheriff. Accordingly, when a sheriff's office becomes vacant, I mean, I don't know if it falls over
This
to
is
school
Lambert,
boards.
isn't it?
Yeah, it's Lambert.
This is Lambert.
It does say Lambert versus Belknap.
Yeah, yeah, and that one was very specific to, even though they talked about, so the county in that instance was relying on the hiring of an employee as the basis for going into non-public, and there were a couple of other issues, but that was the main one.
Was an employee.
But but what the court said is, despite the fact that you're getting paid and you're an employee for purposes of the IRS, you are not an employee for purposes of 91A, you're an official. But it was but then it looked at, you know, the voting aspect of it. And again, I'm just, here's the way the interpretation has gone. And I'm not going to say that I know for 100% that a court will agree with me. I just, you know, this is basically the weight of interpretation has gone in the direction I have. I would say that if you're in that situation, just think long and hard about it. Know that you know, there may be a consequence. The consequence would be you simply have to go redo it.
Right.
As a rule of thumb, less is, in the case of non-public sessions, isn't a good rule of thumb, the less is better?
I'd say the rule of thumb is if the statute applies and the remember there are reasons.
Right.
So the reasons are, the reasons are privacy, safety, and competitive interest. But it is the board that decides that, except in those two instances. And I just don't think we're going to resolve that question. I'm going to say to you that it's an unresolved question. The weight goes this way. But so just because I don't think we can resolve it, let's move on. Just be careful when you approach that question. I think that, you know, that's all we can really suggest.
Another comment?
I'm comfortable with the way you answered the question.
So should we move on to the next page, D? Just to try to rip through these
Yeah,
10 minutes or so.
So consideration of the acquisition, sale, or lease of real or personal property. Let's stop right there for a second. So it's sale or lease of real or personal property. Notice that it doesn't say or services. So if you have a contract that you're talking about that is just you're bidding out your attorney services, or you're bidding out a consultant to come in and work with students or something. Well, that actually might implicate the employee thing, but if it's a services contract, that would not fall within this provision. There are some services, there are some mixed ones, and I think you probably have a little more flexibility. I think this is a hole in the statute, because certainly there are services contracts that implicate the same rationale here. It's just that the language hasn't caught up. But then you've got the next clause. Again, here's a qualifier. Would likely benefit a party or parties whose interests are adverse to those of the general community. So here, it's not just that you're talking about the purchase of real estate or the purchase of property or what have you. It's that particular discussion about it is going to give away a competitive advantage. So you're not talking about the general idea of, do we want to look at buying some real estate? You're talking about that particular piece of, and it might be more general than that, because you might have a few in mind or something. But the conversation is giving some information to the person you're about to negotiate with. And one example that I had, very ugly, and I don't have enough time to say it, but it was a settlement of a piece of litigation, so it's similar. And the board authorized up to X number of dollars. Well, you want your attorney to go to the negotiation and try to get it lower than the amount that they authorized. Well, what happens if the other side already knows what the number is? Well,
Price just went up.
yeah, the price, and that's exactly what happened. But so that's what they're talking about here. And just because I know we're not going to get to sealing all the technical requirements, that this is a place where you should think about how long you're sealing minutes for. Minutes only need to be sealed for as long as they need to be sealed. If it's reputation, that's probably indefinite. But if you're talking about a purchase or sale of real estate, 20 years is an awful long time for, somebody, to be giving up a competitive advantage. There may be circumstances where that's true, because you've got your eye on the big piece of property behind the high school, and, you've got these grand ideas about, so there may be reasons to do that. But that's the kind of place where you should think about how long you're sealing it, because the purpose of the non-public is to maintain your competitive advantage, not, we want to shield this information because we were talking about the sale of real estate. It's the competitive part that you're protecting. Did somebody have a couple questions?
Go ahead, Tracy. Go ahead.
It's probably the same one, indefinite.
Same question.
Indefinite is appropriate for reputation.
Different attorneys have different interpretations. We generally recommend, well, I do anyway, we may disagree on it, and that's fine as well too. So depending on what answer you want, ask for either me or Will.
I just want a good answer. That's it. I just want the correct answer.
Nothing in the right to, I think the simplest way is just seal the minutes, period, without a time frame on them. Whether or not you're supposed to go back and review sealed minutes from time to time and see if the privacy exception still applies and then unseal them if it doesn't is different interpretations from different attorneys. I don't think the right to know law obligates that. Other attorneys who've done this longer than me and whose expertise I certainly respect say you're supposed to go back from time to time, review the unsealed minutes, and if the privacy exception that you've stated to seal them from the get-go no longer exists, then you can, so if you seal them about the purchase of a piece of property and 6 months later you buy the property, why can't you unseal the minutes 10 years later or even a year and a half later? You're right, but I don't think that's clear in the right to know law that you have that obligation to do that, to be quite honest with you. I don't think it specifies that. Some lawyers say that you should, and I don't know if you have a thought on that or not.
The way I approach it is, if at the time you're sealing the minutes, you can articulate, there's no reason to do this for more than 5 years. Now you don't even have to get to the question as to whether you have to review them or not.
Right.
But that said, certainly the weight, the number of districts that simply seal is probably vastly outweighs those that have a specific structure. But I've had districts that have they have one district that was the policy committee. And the policy committee would review. The board voted to authorize the policy committee to open up 2 months worth of sealed minutes every time they met, and they would go through them, and they would either they're sealed or not sealed. But the statute is so vague on that. It's not printed here. It probably is printed later on. It's a very vague, oddly worded sentence. But basically, for reputation, just not even stating a date, just sealing the minutes, that's going to be fine. If it's inappropriate, somebody will bring it up later.
Okay.
If you went into, remember, you've gone into non-public for a legitimate purpose. The information, and by the way, so the reputation, it's the same standard, that the information in the minutes would likely adversely affect the reputation of the person. So you went in, you talked about somebody, and it was all great stuff. You don't have a basis to seal the minutes. So, be mindful of what it is you're sealing. And of course, you haven't seen the minutes yet, so it's hard to do that. But that's something, maybe what time is it?
We're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay. So one of the things when you're sealing the minutes, before you come out of non-public session, you should talk about what the minutes are going to be. Because that's you don't see the minutes when you come out and you move to seal them. But maybe there's no reason to seal the minutes. Maybe you went in for a legitimate basis, you had your discussion, but the minutes
Or not.
don't
disclose
seal them.
anything, right?
And you might gain some credibility with your public if you didn't seal everything just because you can. So I'll just do these real quickly. So the next one, pending claims or litigation, not the trick, but it has to be reduced to writing. Either the threat or the litigation itself has been filed. It can't be you're just talking about whether or not to have a lawsuit or whether somebody's threatened a lawsuit unless it's been in writing. The emergency functions, this really does relate to the shooter, the terrorism, not pushing and shoving in the lunch line, and these are the types of plans. These things are things where you're involving the law enforcement and fire departments and so these are your safety plans or your safety responses. You can enter for non-public session for those. Next one, consideration of entering tuition contract. Key word there is entering. So it's not about your existing tuition contract unless you're talking about renewing it. So they are entering a new one. But if you're having problems under your tuition and contract, that's not sufficient reason. If you do want to explore this one, I suggest you read not only this slide, but read the statute, because there's some extra technical requirements of that one. We did that one. Full page. Was that the last one?
Nope, the legal advice.
Oh, the legal advice. So this was, at one time, it was basically, if the attorney's there, you can be in a non-meeting. If the attorney wasn't there, and there was a letter to the superintendent, could you talk about that letter? Well, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't. So even though it was a privileged letter and it's exempt under the records disclosure, the board can't talk about it. Well, now they can. So this provision here allows you to talk about advice given to you by legal counsel. And those are the reasons. If it doesn't fit within one of those things, then you're in public session. Just the easiest takeaway. There's in the procedures required for non-public, that checklist. If you followed that checklist, you'll be pretty good every time. I walk through, what the minutes are, what the minutes require, who can attend, all of those things. But if you want to take a couple of questions a couple of minutes for just questions, that's great.
You need to get on with your meeting.
We have to
Yeah,
start.
all right. 30 seconds. Thank you for having us up. We hope it was helpful
Fabulous.
for you.
Thank you.
We know it's a lot of information in a short period of time. We could do, the right to know law could be like a 2-day workshop. I think everybody knows and appreciates that. We hope it was helpful. If there's follow-up questions, Jerry, give us a call. If there's continued interest in either another topic on the right to know law or whatever training you would want, reach out to NHSBA at any time. We're happy to come. Thank you for having us. Thank you for your continued membership in NHSBA, and let us know what we can do to help. Great.
Do you know when the next date for your getting-togethers are?